Let me start by thanking my colleague presenters, in thanking the organizers for the invitation, which I was also delighted to accept and to share some of my work with you. And let me also extend a great thank you to the entire team of organizers for making this such a fantastic event. We felt very much welcomed here and at home. Let me also just make a note of correction. In the program, it's pointed out that I'm at ETH Zurich, which was true until last December. I'm now exclusively based at the University of Geneva in the Department of Geography and Environment, where a group of colleagues and me have been working on mountain issues for quite some time. The coherence of the panel, I guess, is given by the fact that energy is very important to mountains, and transport is also very important to mountains. I'm going to be talking about mountain governance, or more specifically, sustainable development governance in transnational mountain areas, which, as I will try to show, is a little bit different. But as any of these functional policy domains, if you want, that Harry's listed in his presentation this morning. First of all, it's important to point out why we should care about them in the first place. So, a word about mountains. They cover 27% of the world's land area. 1.2 billion people live in mountain areas. 90% of those in developing and transition countries, and 30% of these are vulnerable to food insecurity. Mountain areas are reckoned to be the source of 60 to 80% of the world's fresh water, and they harbor 50% of globally recognized biodiversity hotspots. Over the last 15 to 20 years, more 10 to 15 years, it's also become increasingly clear that mountain areas are relatively greater have a relatively greater vulnerability to climate change. This manifests in a number of ways, including impact on natural hazards, natural disasters, biodiversity, because the topography is so complex, a lot of species cannot move easily in short periods of time, and water resources. We know already, and this is seen in many mountain areas around the world, that as a result of climate change, hydrological regimes are changing throughout the year. Mountains as an issue have been recognized on the global agenda. Again, the story is familiar for other issue areas, but at Rio 1992, a particular specific chapter was dedicated to mountains, chapter 13, which called for improved coordination of regional efforts to protect fragile mountain ecosystems through the consideration of appropriate mechanisms, including regional, legal, and other instruments. Then in 2002, we had the International Year of Mountains, which mobilized a lot of local and national efforts around the world. A lot of countries used the opportunity to review their policies towards mountain areas, and in some cases, new mountain laws were actually created. Also in 2002, we saw the establishment of the Mountain Partnership in follow-up to Johannesburg. Whether that falls into the category of a paper partnership or a more active one, I will not go into here. Suffice it to say that there are big discussions going on at the moment as to the nature of its future. Researchers have been very active in promoting the global mountain agenda as well. In fact, it's not a stretch to say that without the close collaboration of a number of scientists in the lead up to Rio, there would not be a chapter on mountains in Agenda 21, and for that reason, people who work on mountains in sympathetic ways refer to the so-called mountain mafia, which is a handful of scientists with some representatives of bilateral donors who have pushed this agenda very strongly. So since 2006, there has been a concerted effort among scientists to try to identify key research needs and gaps, and this is a process that continues today. Finally, in 2012, we had this beautiful mountain pavilion. Those who were in Rio maybe saw it in person. I didn't, but I found the logo on the web, so here it is. And the outcome document, of course, also recognizes the benefits derived from mountain regions, which are essential for sustainable development. In other words, there have been 20 years of continuous mobilization around the issue of mountains at the global level. And the question is, what has this translated into and where? And what does that tell us about the post-2015 world? First, let me say also that while there are some classic cases of mountain initiatives, such as the Alpine Convention, the Carpathian Convention, there are not too many around of these kinds of conventions. But what I would argue is that mountain initiatives, whether they are conventions or not, are a form of regional governance. And in some work that I did with colleagues at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, we analyzed the International Environmental Agreements database of Ron Mitchell at the University of Oregon and added some information, some variables that allowed us to tease out what kinds of international environmental agreements there really are and which ones of those are regional. So here is just one excerpt from that work where you see that there have historically been more regional initiatives than non-regional initiatives, and I won't go into the definition here, but that they've more or less followed the same curve with peaks in the 70s and in the 90s, and that there has been a decline since. Another look at this dimension of mountain initiatives as regional cooperation. We counted initiatives, agreements between 1945 and 2005 because information on bilateral agreements after 2005 was no longer there or consistent, and found that roughly 60% of agreements during that period are regional. And these include the mountain agreements. Also, there is sometimes the bias or the perceived bias towards Europe and North America. That is to say, some people argue that, yes, regional agreements are fine, but it's mostly something that we find in the EU and North America. We looked at the global distribution and found that, in fact, regional agreements appear pretty much everywhere. I just wanted to throw out these numbers here, not to suggest that mountains are typical of regional agreements, but that they are a case of regional agreements, and that we should think of them in that larger perspective nonetheless. Now, what do we actually have today? There is a history of platforms, partnerships, whatever name you want to call them, among sub-regional, subnational governments that started in the 1970s in the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the Jura. Then, as I mentioned, in 1991, a year before Rio, we saw the signing of the Alpine Convention by 7 countries in the EU. Importantly here, and this is a theme that I will be coming back to, the Alpine Convention is really seen as one of the first international treaties that focuses specifically on sustainable development. So it's not just about forests, it's not just about biodiversity, it really covers the spectrum. And the reason or the way this is manifested is by having a framework protocol approach where protocols cover everything from transport to forestry to biodiversity, planning, etc. Then followed the Carpathian Convention in 2003, some convention processes in Southeast Europe and the Caucasus that have not produced a convention, but have nonetheless followed this inspiration from the Alpine Convention and tried to bring together different sectors in a sustainable development approach. There are some other initiatives in mountain areas that are not necessarily mountain initiatives, primarily because the mountain range is not perceived or framed as a mountain range, but rather either as a biodiversity corridor or as a forest area. Now with colleagues who are experts on these different mountain areas, we try to take stock of what some of the experiences have been, and I'll mention a few here before I conclude with some thoughts on what this might mean for the new social contract and the SDGs. The first thing, and I think this is quite important, when we talk about governance at the global level, there is one globe. When we move to the regional level, we have to be clear about what the region is. So in regional agreements, and this includes mountain areas, there is initially and continuously a debate about how to delimit that region. And this is seen in all the mountain initiatives, but there is some variation, and the variation has much to do with how narrowly or how broadly the substantive scope of the agreement is defined. That is to say, if an agreement focuses narrowly on a particular issue, then the delimitation is not so difficult to define. Once you move into a context where sustainable development, which is by nature and definition cross-sectoral, is at the center of attention, it becomes more complicated. And in fact, what you find is that you have suddenly different areas that overlap, that partially overlap. So in a mountain range like the Alps, for instance, you have a certain delimitation for forestry dynamics, you have another one for transport, you still have another one for biodiversity, which may imply corridors from the Carpathians through the Alps to the Pyrenees. So you have this overlap of multiple functional spaces, and that has implications for sustainable development governance. A second point that we looked at is the institutionalization of cooperation. Here, as I mentioned before, one thing that we found is that not all governance in mountain regions is mountain governance. That is to say, although we might have an Alpine Convention, we also have a biodiversity convention that applies to the Alpine area. We have a whole host of EU legislation, and this is the same for mountain areas around the world. So in fact, this has been something that's been difficult for the mountain lobby, if you want to call it that, raising awareness of mountains in places where mountain ranges are defined, say, as a biodiversity corridor. The argument is quickly there, well, we already have the biodiversity conventions, why do we need to build something up around mountains? There's also great variety in the degrees of institutionalization. As I mentioned, we have intergovernmental treaties on the model of the Alps, which in turn were inspired by the framework protocol design of Baltic cooperation. But then we also have numerous operational programs, and we have very loose NGO alliances. For instance, the Y2Y is the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative in North America, which is really a connection of NGOs that is trying to, again, mostly focus on habitat connectivity. Multi-level governance embeddedness is extensive. Regional agreements, whether it's in the domain of the environment or in economics or security, are sometimes looked at from the perspective of whether they are building blocks or obstacles to global cooperation. As for mountains, it's clear that they are embedded in very different institutional contexts across all different levels. As I mentioned, biodiversity is important in mountains, so regional agreements in mountain areas are embedded in the global biodiversity regime. In fact, there's a working group on mountain biodiversity and so on. And it goes the other way as well, in that local or sub-regional mountain initiatives are connected to and promoted by range-wide initiatives. Another important point here is, and I'll come back to that at the end, that adaptation to local needs is omnipresent and paramount because or in spite of policy diffusion. In one project that we have ongoing at the moment, we started with the idea that, or with the hypothesis that the Alpine Convention has been such an inspirational instrument for other regions working around the mountain area that we would expect to see some policy diffusion. But we also argued that we would find quite a bit of adaptation in different mountain regions. And in fact, there is a lot. So whereas the Alpine Convention, for instance, has somewhat of an environmental bias in mountain convention processes in Southeast Europe or the Caucasus, other issues are much more important, including security. And once you move to the Himalayas, it's even stronger, and the same in Central Asia. Defining sustainable mountain development. The framework convention of the Alpine Convention doesn't actually mention the term sustainable development. The term is mentioned explicitly in the protocols, but a lot of debate in the early history and today in the Alpine Convention has been around what is actually sustainable development. It was defined and continues to be defined not principally but largely by means of the cross-sectoral or intersectoral focus of the instrument. But there are different emphases in different mountain ranges, as I mentioned, and in a sense, you could say that varieties of sustainable development are the norm. There is not an official definition of sustainable mountain development unless you use the classic definitions of sustainable development and attack mountains on, which you can do with coastal areas or arid areas and so on. So in the sense that sustainable development in transboundary mountain initiatives has emerged from practice. And because even though mountain regions are similar in their vulnerability to elevation, slope, and aspect, quite different emphases on the social, environmental, and economic dimensions of sustainability have been defined. When it comes to action on the ground, implementation and coordination, again, there's a large variety of things that you see, phenomena that you see. Implementation can encompass, depending on the instrument used, compliance and accountability, which is important to the Alpine and Carpathian Conventions, where you have programs or projects, intersectoral cooperation is more important. And in a lot of cases, you also find various synergetic effects. This is not just by virtue of there being a mountain initiatives, other types of regional initiatives have the same kinds of synergetic effects, but because mountain initiatives often have this claim of being cross-sectoral, the synergetic effects imply a lot of cross-sectoral manifestations in other areas as well. So you have transnational networks, for instance, that cover different issue areas. You have networks of municipalities that are interested in anything from local economic development to conservation. And of course, you have the research networks that come along. Effectiveness then, I'll skip the second point here. Effectiveness is context-specific and often includes non-material impacts such as awareness raising and identity building. I think the emphasis on identity is not just something that comes out of the interest of my geographer colleagues, but is something that's quite important to note when it comes to regional agreements, because as I mentioned before, when you move into a sustainable development context and you have different overlapping functional areas, it's much more difficult to build identities around functional areas than if you had a territorial area where place-based development can take place. So mountain initiatives, in a sense, try to find that compromise between bringing together functional policy domains, but in a place-based context. And this identity building is something that you see quite a lot emerging from mountain regions. This is the last slide, I think. Some implications for mountains in the post-2015 SDG world. I think first of all, it's important to recall that there are varieties of sustainability below the global level. I think it's not a question of deciding whether there should be one universal set of sustainable development goals or whether there should only be local or regional manifestations. I think it is important to note that the two have to complement each other and that sustainability emerges from practice. And practice occurs in processes that are not just global. They can be local or they can be regional. The second insight I would say that one can gain from looking at transboundary mountain regions is one that I mentioned before, territory and function. Sustainability is linked to identity, and identity emerges from place-based development. It's very interesting to witness the debates that are going on in the EU at the moment around the phenomenon of macro regions. I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but macro regions is sort of a new instrument that's supposed to consolidate, streamline, scale up a lot of these very small cross-border projects in territorial cooperation. And we've had two for some years, one in the Baltic, one in the Danube region. And the discourse there is that a macro region does not have a spatial delimitation. It's an amalgam of partially overlapping functional regions. And it's very interesting to see how different actors deal with that. But there is typically a tendency to want to see some kind of spatial delimitation precisely because it's easier to build identities around spatial perimeters than it is around functional policy domains. Another one that maybe is a bit more provocative, we often have this rationalist approach of form follows function. That is, if only we had some agreement on the goals, then the way to implement these goals would somehow naturally follow. I think what we see in looking and comparing at these mountain initiatives, that the reverse is often true as well. So function can follow forms. Declarations don't just drop into empty spaces. There always is some already pre-existing form. And what we find in the domain of mountain initiatives is that the pre-existing form is precisely the norm of mountain cooperation that is based on the idea that it should be cross-sectoral. i.e. should focus on sustainable development. So if a mountain initiative emerges somewhere, whether it's in Southeast Europe or the Caucasus or Central Asia, there is already a form there that has to be taken account in the definition of the function. And finally, perhaps the most provocative is has to do with redundancy. I think there's been, and Frank will be the first to acknowledge this, there's been quite some work recently on the issue of institutional interlinkage, institutional interplay, overlap, duplication, and so on. If one read there's a famous report, an evaluation of the UNEP system that was extremely critical of all the duplication and overlap that one found. I think there's no question that a lot of resources are being wasted because of duplication, but I think looking at mountain initiatives, we also must recognize that some duplication is not necessarily bad. And I think this is generally the case for regional agreements. I think there's something to be said for having multiple venues where policy approaches can be tested. Mountain areas are sometimes referred to as laboratories for sustainable development. So I think it's time to move beyond the black and white thinking of good or bad, and perhaps recognize, as did public administration scholar in the 60s, Martin Landau, that there can be good redundancy. And I think the argument that he made, and this was personal experience of his, he was approaching an airport somewhere in a plane, and the landing gear failed, and he was afraid he was going to die. And then they landed safely because they had a redundant landing gear. So the argument that he started to develop, looking at public administration specifically, is that there is good and bad redundancy, and that the more system critical a certain environment is, the more important it is to build in good redundancy. And I'll stop there, hopefully in time.